Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the August 8th, 2023 Planning Commission regular meeting to order. The Planning Commission is holding hybrid meetings. Members of the public can attend the meeting in person or observe the meeting on Zoom, online by visiting www.cityofarcata.org and following the live meetings link at the bottom of the city's homepage or on the city's YouTube channel. If you are attending remotely, please be aware that the Zoom feed provides the closest to real-time stream. If you rely on the other feeds and you wish to make comments, please be aware of the time lag on those feeds. The first item on our agenda is the land acknowledgement. The City of Arcata acknowledges that the lands we are located on are the unceded ancestral lands of the Wiyot tribe. The land that Arcata rests on is known in the Wiyot language as Gudene, meaning over in the woods or among the redwoods. Past actions by local, state, and federal governments removed the Wiyot and other indigenous peoples from the land and threatened to destroy their cultural practices. The City of Arcata acknowledges the Wiyot community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. This acknowledgement seeks to aid in dismantling the legacy narratives of settler colonialism. And next on our agenda this evening is roll call. And just before we call roll, wanted to offer a warm welcome to Abby Strickland, our newest planning commissioner. It's great to be back up to full strength and glad to have you with us. Staff, will you please call roll?
Commissioner Simmons?
Here.
Commissioner Strickland?
Present.
Commissioner Mayer?
Here.
Commissioner Yodowitz?
Here.
Commissioner Lehman?
Here.
And Chair Davies?
Here.
And I'll note that Vice Chair Tagnia is not here just yet.
All right, we'll be joined this evening by Community Development Department Staff Director David Loya. And next we will have public comment. During this time, people may make comments about items that are not on the agenda. If you wish to speak on one of our agenda items, you will have an opportunity when we are discussing those items. If you have comments about items that are not listed on our agenda today, please line up now behind the lectern. In the interest of fairness to all commenters, if you begin talking about items that are on the agenda, I will gently interrupt you and direct you to share those comments during the appropriate agenda item. If you're on Zoom and you wish to make oral communications on matters that are not on today's agenda, please raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon on the right side of your screen or by pressing *9 if you are calling in. For those on Zoom, when it is your turn to speak, the clerk will unmute you. With that, I'd like to open public comment. Each speaker will have 2 minutes to comment during early oral communications. Feel free to state your name for the record. May we have the first speaker, please?
Greetings. I just happened to see Commissioner Mayer walk into the meeting and forgot that we now have 5:30 meetings, not 6 o'clock. So I am here. My name is Joanne McGarry. And I've been walking around town all day for a variety of reasons and noticing a variety of things. And walkability is very important to me in our town, and getting people to use cars less and less cars in our town is an ideal that I would really like to promote in our community. I think in a big picture kind of way, I leave it to people like Fred and others to talk about specifics, but I think it's important for our commission, our city's committees and commissions and the city council to acknowledge not only the land we are on is the land of unceded land of Wiyot people, but it's also a land that is geologically evolving rapidly now in the Anthropocene in terms of climate change and what's happening with our sea level rise. And refugees coming here for our better climate, and the need for us to create a future in our small rural college town. That's really important, small rural college town. To create a place that is easy to get around in, easy to live in, affordable to live in, and thrivable to live in collectively. These are big, broad topics, but it's really important to me that we always step back from focusing on the narrow to the big picture. And I just picked up, as I saw him walking into the bookstore, Daniel Duncan's new book called 2022 Arcata. So I highly recommend you take a look at it. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments.
Good evening. For the last 5 years, I've experienced something that I haven't experienced in 8 other cities that I've lived in California. And that is the fact that nothing is being done from the standpoint of our public safety. Cars that are basically speeding all the time. They're not stopping at stop signs. They're basically putting our bicyclists and any folks that are walking in crosswalks in danger. I'm in shock at the fact that I've never seen a police officer stop anybody for any of these outrageous things that are being done. And I'll give you an example. Just at one intersection, 16th and H, I've witnessed a car in a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit in a school zone hit a truck, flip over. I've witnessed a car hit 3 stationary cars at the intersection. I've heard and had my power go out from a car hitting a telephone pole and knocking the telephone pole over. And I've also had several neighbors that also have had their cars run into. So those are all good examples of, not even cars moving that are being hit. So obviously there's a big problem. Any of the other cities that I've lived in, they've done something about it. There's nothing being done. There's nothing being done as far as cars that are modifying their exhaust. And I brought this up for a year and a half, and I've written to you, nothing's been doing there. Also, over a year ago when Julia was the chairperson too, that we brought up the high school from the standpoint of what she witnessed from Alliance. Parents are dropping their kids off, they're running across the road. From my end, the buses are basically 2 or 3 students that are arriving on the buses in the morning, and there's a long line of parents drop off at the lunch hour. It's also pretty shocking how many kids are taken off at lunch hour in their own cars. So as far as a standpoint of, the buses, it doesn't seem to be working, and that's the younger generation.
Thank you for those comments.
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. I'm Fred Wise. First, I want to welcome our newest Commissioner. Welcome, and thank you for being here. There's a clerical error. The business item listed for tonight is the same as it was for last time, which I think may further confuse the public on what we're going to talk about. The Commissioners may want to request a date for when the EIR is scheduled, when you may talk about the local coastal plan. And if there is an update available on the Plan West schedule of work, that includes studies, a noise study, air quality study, soils report. An article on that has gotten over 600 views on arcata1.com. For the public comment before tonight's specific business item, I request it not be at the beginning of the session, but after the commissioners have spoken. Otherwise, the public doesn't know what to talk about. We really don't know what is going to happen because of the vagueness of the listing of the business item. The framework that you developed was successfully used to go through things, but it's used sometimes, not other times. I think it should be used for the other considerations table, and a gradient voting process should be used, because if someone feels very strongly about something, it gets lost in a strict 4-to-1 or 5-to-1 vote. Whereas with gradient voting, it would stand out more. And most businesses, if one person feels a strong need to say something, they'll say it. It's not based on a vote before it's talked about. There's new articles on arcata1.com about 3D modeling, and a request for more 3D modeling now that we're in the form-based code section of our talks. Thanks.
Thanks for your comments. Anybody online, David?
We do have folks online. I'm going to ask the folks that are online that wish to talk to lower their hands and raise their hands again. We're having a technical problem here. There we go. Okay, I see you now. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hi everyone, this is Anthony here. I have you on the hands-free. I'm still on my way home from work. But I wanted to make sure I got on today and made some comments. You may remember me a few weeks ago discussing the problem with representation that occurs when higher and vested interest to guide the city development instead of making a greater effort to work within the public. You know, we do have experts that are here who have a vested interest in seeing this community thrive and not just their business. And on that note, I wanted to also point out that San Francisco is facing an interesting point in its city development where they have to fine people for having vacant space in their buildings because they have destroyed the quality of life and the economy in San Francisco so terribly that they can't even keep people in their buildings despite all of the people living on the streets. And that's something that I think Arcata is in danger of achieving itself if it doesn't consider the local economy, because in the last 5 years or more, we've taken some really serious hits to our economy. One was, you know, the commercialization of cannabis and how that drastically altered the flow of the economy up here. And then another important thing was the pandemic, which really destroyed a lot of businesses and a lot of people's lives and livelihoods. And I know that the California population density bonus law is intended to stimulate our local economy. But whenever I bring up how can we protect our local economy or support our local businesses or recirculate the money and wealth into this community, I hate to say this about someone specifically, but David Loya always brings up the word protectionism as if it's a bad, illegal thing.
Thanks for your comments, Anthony. Thank you very much.
One more thing, though, please.
No, that's your time. Thank you. We appreciate your comments.
Go ahead, Jane.
Hi there, Jane Woodward. I simply want to second Fred's comments. We have had process issues all the way along, and I think some of the comments that are very wisely brought forward by individuals are just overridden and not given serious consideration and discussion. I find that a problem. Similarly, comments from the public. So I understand you all get different points of view and different suggestions, but I think, I mean, we're just going to have to try at the city council level, since we aren't necessarily getting any major consideration at the planning commission level on some of our most major concerns. And I really wish you'd do something about K Street as a priority. Not L Street, K Street. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments.
That's all we have online.
All right. Well, thank you for everyone who shared comments in person or online. We appreciate your participation and input. We will now move to item 3 on our agenda this evening, which is our consent calendar. All items on the consent calendar are considered to be routine by the commission and are enacted in one motion. Commissioners or members of the public can request that an item be removed for separate discussion. The only item on our consent calendar this evening is item A, approve Planning Commission minutes for our regular meeting, July 11, 2023. Does anyone on the commission or member of the public wish to pull that consent item for discussion?
I'd like to pull that item, please.
All right. Motion is pulled. Judith, do you want to tell us what your concerns are?
Yeah, we still haven't quite managed to get the format consistent for our reporting of minutes and votes in particular. Typically, I actually went back and looked at the minutes from the last few months, even with our scaled down action reporting. And we do need to report the actual votes on those action items unless they are unanimous, in which case we have our attendance list. We need to know who voted yes, who voted no, and who abstained. And so for this last week, the Boat Mixed-Use Development Design Review was approved by majority vote, but we do need to know who did not vote with that majority. It happened to be me, which is why I noticed it. And I'd like to make sure that our future minutes, as well as this one, do record actual votes rather than simply noting that an item was passed by majority.
Okay. David, you want to provide any staff input there? Can we add that level of clarity to the
Yeah,
minutes?
we can add the roll call to the item 5A instead of currently reads on motion by Commissioner Simmons and second by Commissioner Yodowitz. By majority vote, we'll replace that with the roll call.
In a couple of the earlier minutes from this year, there was a really nice little chart that went with the votes that simply listed yay, nay, abstain. And it's super easy to look at, and I'd love to see that.
A good format.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a roll call vote. We'll identify which commissioner voted in which way on each item. Is that getting it?
Yeah, I'm just noting that in the actual minutes that are put online, it's not just written in narrative form. There's a little chart that comes in there so that you can instantly look at that item and say, oh, okay, that's what
I'll have to
happened.
look at that. That may be something that our program that manages the agendas puts in automatically. So I'll go back and look at that and see if I can figure out what you're talking about. And I will reach out to you if I cannot figure it out, and we'll see if we can track it down.
With that, I'd like to move to amend the minutes and
You'd like to move to approve those minutes as amended?
move to amend the minutes and approve them as amended, yes.
Okay, we have a first motion. Do we have a second?
I would second that motion.
First and a second, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Should I abstain considering I wasn't there for these minutes?
You can abstain if you'd like to. You're basically accepting the minutes into the record, and so you can also vote if you'd like to. If you feel like you've watched the meeting and have familiarity with it, you can vote.
I'll abstain.
Okay, motion passes. All right, we have no public hearings this evening, so we'll move on to our business items. We have one business item tonight, and that is to consider a recommendation to the city council on the general plan updates. As usual, can we begin with a staff report, please?
Yeah, I'll be very brief, just to orient to the opportunities for tonight for the commission to to review work that's sort of outstanding from its prior discussion guides. And then there was a little bit of cleanup with the other considerations table, which I do have up on the screen. At this time, the commission got to the point where they were, basically had worked through all the issues. The two items that you see before you now in yellow regarding lane widths were something the commission wanted to continue to discuss, and it sounded like there was a desire to make a recommendation for 10-foot wide lane widths around those. And so with the exception of those two, it seemed like at that point the commission was ready to take action previously. And then we have the discussion guide, which has some outstanding items that were not discussed in Commissioner Mayer's absence on, some of the gateway topics. And then there are also some other outstanding bike rack issues on that. So we can start there, if you'd like.
Yeah, that sounds good. I think that's a good way forward.
Could I just ask a question? In your staff report, you indicated that we were going to be talking about the density bonus and community benefit stuff. Is that also happening today?
All of that is on the table. I really wanted to leave this time up to the discretion of the commission to, get into the topics that you feel like are most relevant. Obviously, for the Gateway Area Plan, the general plan elements, we're going to be doing study sessions with the city council. And so whatever you feel like is most appropriate for you to be prepared for those sessions, I feel like is where you should focus your time. If you want to clear out the bike rack and make sure that you've got, a second set of recommendations to the city council on those items, that's appropriate. Or, if you want to get into more detail on the density bonus, we did produce a short video on the density bonus and shared that with the council, commission, and community. So we can certainly talk about that. It's up to you all where you want to take this.
I have a sort of pretty clear idea of how I'd like us to sort of tackle things, but I think we should take public comment and then we can open our discussions. We will have public comment next, and each speaker will have 3 minutes. Feel free to state your name for the record. May we please have the first speaker? Anyone here cares to speak?
Gregory Daggett. I think one of the most important issues that we had a commission, sea level rise. We had experts that came in and gave their opinion on what, especially the Barrel District. And I'll remind you that I remember one was quite sincere in saying that this was a really bad idea when some of our council members asked from the standpoint, why would you want to invest so much in an area that's going to be affected by sea level rise in the future? And the rest of the panel, which was NOAA, Coastal Commission, and another consultant that the city had hired in the past, they sounded pretty lukewarm to the whole idea. They didn't really feel too comfortable about that particular area and doing development. So it's a subject matter that hasn't seemed to be brought up since that joint session that we had with the city council. And I mean, it's the main game here. Why would you go for 7 stories specifically in probably the worst particular area in the whole city to do it? And you're kind of acting sort of like the old Army Corps of Engineers in a way, thinking that you can just, build it and it's going to last. I mean, if you really want a 7-story building, why aren't you doing what a lot of the experts that have written you that I've seen in newspapers and letters to the city and say, build it on bedrock, build it in another part of the city. I mean, this was the city's position like 6 years ago. We're not going to build towards the bay. We're going to build towards the hills where we're not going to have to have these issues in the future. So I'm just really confused why you seem to be so gung-ho about still doing the Barrel District when, they gave their opinion and those were the experts, and we seem to have no discussion since that. I'd also point out from doing a lot of research that cities that have sort of the same situation that we have gambled a little bit and built, they haven't put a 7-story structure in there. They've done their light industrial or high tech and brought in, some people and generated a lot of income for people to be able to afford places. And then their housing has gone a little bit further away from the bay. And those people then can walk to work, they can bicycle to work. So I'm just kind of like a little surprised that from the economic analysis that, this is a comment I hear from everybody. It's like, how am I going to afford to live there? It's like building costs are like $500 a square foot now too. So, I mean, it's another subject that hasn't been addressed. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments.
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. I'm Fred Wise with Arcata1.com. I had requested that the Commissioners have some speaking before public comment was open because we have no idea what you're going to talk about tonight. Probably the other considerations table. The other considerations table, there's nothing in there that dates after September 2022, almost a year ago, except Transportation Safety Committee has a clarification of something they said in August 2022. It doesn't seem right to just confine ourselves to things that are a year old here. The Community Benefits Program, if we get to that, the Commission created the items. I'll point out that staff assigned the points. It is my opinion that the points system is very skewed and doesn't accomplish what I think the Commissioners want to accomplish. And you can look at just the actual allocation of points on that. As an example, as I brought up before, having a community garden that is under 500 square feet, which would be something that could be 2 feet by 2 feet square in a literal sense, gets the same amount of points as providing owner-occupied housing, 20% owner-occupied housing, which is entirely different skew there. The Humboldt Association of Realtors requested a 10% allotment of owner-occupied housing. That wasn't even discussed last week or 2 weeks ago. There is an update, as we know, of the version 3, July 11th of the Gateway Area Plan. There's still a large amount of contradictory information within the plan, and I guess I could be do the work of finding it. But there's dozens of things that in one section it says one thing, and another section says something quite different. Jane Woodward referred to a comment. I wasn't saying that the public's not listened to, although I do believe that's the case. I believe the Commissioners aren't being listened to. At some point, the Commission may want to discuss more about affordable housing. There is, I believe, 2.5 pages in a agenda packet some months ago, but it was never discussed. I'm very critical of what was written, and my criticism can be found on Arcata1.com. I think there are avenues that we can go forward on this, but not what's been suggested. The whole idea that if there's more housing, that the price will go down is, how can I say it? I don't think that's true, okay? I think it would take 5,000 apartments for the price to go down. If we're planning on building 500 units over the next 20 years, it is not going to make the price go down. The price, I believe, will go up because of cost of construction. Thanks.
Thanks for your comments, Fred.
I just want to agree with Fred. This format is really kind of bizarre to me, that previously, like at city council meetings, the council members discuss something and then they open it up for public comment, and then they go back and kind of meld some of what they've heard together with what they had discussed previously. So this seems a little bit different in terms of discussing some of these things. And I'm just puzzled by our small rural college town just being so detached somehow from what's happening here and what's happening out in the real world, and why there's not a lot more community engagement, because I think it isn't really inviting for us to just come here and try and figure out what you guys are thinking and what you're deciding upon. And it just seems to me we could be a little bit more democratic in how we're discussing things, and it's not going to take a whole lot of time to do that. But not knowing where you guys are coming from based on what you're being presented with by staff, you know, I don't do my homework. It's been historically my issue, but I really want to understand what's going on in my town, and it's my town as much as it's anybody else's town. And so just let's have a conversation about what you're thinking. What is your broad umbrella vision of planning for the future for us?
Thanks, Joanne. Appreciate your comments. Anybody online waiting to share?
Yep. Go ahead, Colin.
Good evening, Commissioners. This is Colin Fisk with CRTP, the Coalition for Responsible Transportation Priorities. I just wanted to start off by saying thanks for all of your work getting to this point. It's exciting that we're here, and we continue to be excited about the Gateway Plan and the general plan updates and the zoning code updates that really go a long way towards improving bike and pedestrian and transit friendliness in planning. So thank you for all of that. With that said, I wanted to address a few of the transportation related items which I think may still be outstanding. And I did send some written comments. Hopefully you got those, but I'll just briefly summarize. One is that I'd like to try and make sure that redesigns of K and 11th Street for bike and pedestrian safety and comfort are really at the top of the agenda. If those need to be separated out from the Gateway and general plan update process, that's fine, but just that we don't lose the importance of near-term action there. Another item is speed limits on those same streets. HCOG had suggested lowering the speed limits to 20 miles an hour there. Due to recent changes in state law, that is easier than it used to be and would really encourage you to look into that. Also, the lane width item, which I already briefly discussed, we strongly support moving to a 10-foot standard. I think you all probably know the reasons for that. And finally, on the issue of parking meter revenues, there are a lot of different ways that you can implement parking meters to more effectively manage existing parking and to reduce the subsidy for driving. And also, you can then use the revenues to improve investment in public transit, in walking and biking infrastructure. There are a variety of different mechanisms for doing that. I'm happy to discuss that with any of you further if you're interested, but really would encourage you to investigate that as a way to sort of put your money where your mouth is in terms of supporting mode shift in Arcata. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thanks, Colin.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Good evening, Commissioners. I would have to agree with Fred about the timing of public comment. Without clarity in each agenda item regarding specificity on topics being discussed, it would be helpful for the public to speak following Commissioner discussion and prior to deliberations. In the 30 years that I have been speaking before the Commission, this is how it has been done. It enables preparedness and efficiency and would be helpful not only for the public, but for the Commission as well. I will once again remind the Commission that you have not yet discussed the issue of the sphere of influence and protective language regarding agricultural land in the general plan. I have already provided you with detailed information in writing about this issue, and I would like to ask for a time certain for this discussion to occur at a future time. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments.
Go ahead, Jane.
Good evening again, Jane Woodward. I too want to thank you for all the work you've been doing. It's very frustrating to try to tackle all this. It's frustrating for the public to try to keep up with it, and particularly, as everybody has noted, to try to figure out exactly what you're going to talk about tonight so we know what to talk about ourselves. I want to second everybody's comments to date, including Colin's, because I think we think fairly similarly along the need to address parking and 10-foot wide lanes, etc. I do particularly, as usual, want to address the issue of building 7-story buildings in the coastal zone subject to sea level rise within the next anywhere from 20 to 50 years, 60 years. I think it's insane, frankly. And I don't know whether you have gotten any of this authorized or agreed upon by the Coastal Commission, but I would guess you're going to have problems there. But I just don't understand why that's where you're thinking of putting multi-story dense housing when it doesn't make sense to me. I don't think it would make sense to developers, and I don't understand why you haven't brought them in to discuss it with you. So I find that a big flaw in the discussions to date. We requested that months and months and months ago, and you have never done it. So I hope you will have a serious discussion of how building dense housing fits in the coastal zone. And there have been multiple discussions of this, multiple comments I presented as well as others. Thank you very much. You've got a lot of work.
Thank you for your comments, Jane.
That appears to be all the public comment online.
All right, thank you for that. I'd like to bring our deliberations back to the commission. Before we begin, as staff mentioned, there is some leftover business from our last meeting, and I'd like to start off by taking up just finalizing our approving of the other considerations table. This is something we had voted for at our last meeting, and then just didn't finalize that discussion. So the packet does include the decisions we made then, and my question to the commission is to just see if anyone has any object to formalizing the recommendation, which was an outcome of our discussion at our last meeting.
Let me ask, are we going to take up these issues right there?
Yeah, my recollection from the discussion you had last time was that the lane width issue was the item that you were pulling off of the other considerations, but that you were forwarding on the rest of the other considerations recommendations.
Do you think you could let us see the full width of that chart?
I can certainly show you the full list. You won't be able to read it if I show the whole list. We did go through this last time, line by line, until commissioners got to the point where they said, okay, let's skip ahead to only the 3s and 2s.
Yeah, I was asking about the full width.
Full width?
Yeah. For those 2 highlighted items.
Gotcha. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Although our discussion right now is not about the highlighted items, it's about everything but the highlighted items. So what I'm trying to say is really a mere formality that we finalize the work we did last time when we voted to approve those. I just need to check in with everyone and make sure there's no objections to us formalizing the work we did at our last meeting. And then we can begin looking at the items in yellow, which we needed further discussion on. Does anyone object to that? Okay, so let's wrap that and move into those highlighted items that we had pegged for further discussion.
Okay. Sorry about that. Wanted to make sure I got a note there. Okay, so do you want to then jump into these 2 items? I think the proposal on the table would be to make the lane widths 10 feet as a starting point. And Commissioner Simmons?
I'll just give the pitch for this quickly. The narrower the lane, the slower cars will travel. Cars don't go the speed limit. They go the speed that they feel they can safely move. And that's why lanes on freeways are wider, right? It's to encourage cars to move faster. And so when Dan Burden was here, he advocated for 10-foot lanes because it slows down traffic, creates more pedestrian safety. And so that is the reason for CRTP and the public members' suggestion.
Go ahead, Judith.
Yeah, that makes sense if you're assuming that drivers are actually primarily concerned with their own safety rather than the safety of pedestrians, bikers, and kids. And I think the only way I would really recommend reducing your typical lane from 12 to 10 feet is if we also reduce the maximum speed, the speed limit, to 20 miles an hour or less. And for any section of the road that has a 25 mile an hour speed limit, I think we need 12-foot wide lanes. just people open car doors, not all streets have bike lanes, kids run out in front of cars in bad light, and in those cases, that on a two-way street, that extra 4 feet makes a big difference. And I'm not sure that was taken into account, but I would recommend both reducing the speed limit and in areas where the speed limit is reduced to consider reducing the lane width.
Peter?
I strongly support the 10-foot width. Mr. Burton, when he was here, he made a direct relationship between the width of the lane and the speed that cars drive. That the narrower the lane, the slower cars drive. And I agree that a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit is a great idea. But having a physically small width will encourage that. Let me keep going with that. I supported the KL couplet when it came up. I still think it's a good idea. If L Street were indeed 10 feet wide, and by the way, I was out there yesterday. I didn't measure with the tape, but I stepped off L Street, and it's about 15 feet wide right now. And if it were 10 feet wide, there would be plenty of room for L Street and a linear park. And if K Street were one way and reduced to a 10-foot lane and there were no parking, it would give us an enormous width to work with. Bigger sidewalks, isolated bike lanes, and it could be a wonderful street if it were one way and only 10 feet wide. In terms of what to do immediately, I think if we made if K Street were still two ways before this happened, and we made the lanes 10 feet wide, that would improve safety dramatically and took parking away. That could be an interim step to really improve K Street and improve the safety.
I agree with your points there, but I want to make sure we're centering our discussion not on the couplet concept, but just in general, a reduction of road widths to 10 feet. Joel, did you want to weigh in on this? Where do you land on this?
Well, it makes sense to me logically. I'm not an engineer, a traffic engineer, or architect, so it'd be nice to see some data, I'm sure there are reports out there that people have analyzed this issue in other jurisdictions, and that if something like that could be provided to us and the public, that would help. I mean, if I had to vote now, I'd say, yeah, I'm in support of 10 feet and reducing the speed limit because it makes sense to me. But again, because of my lack of technical expertise in that area, that does trouble me a little bit.
Can I just jump in? If you look at what I said up there, I cited a Bloomberg article that goes into a lot of the research about lane widths and talks about why they're safer. I'll also say I agree the speed limit should be 20 miles per hour. That was a comment from a public member being HCOG, saying that the speed limit should be reduced to 20 on K and 11th Street. I was the only commissioner that voted to discuss that item, and so we didn't get to it. But I think we could couple those things, but I don't think they have to be, mandatorily tied together, right? Like, I think we can start out by trying to reduce lane widths, and then also, because there's a complicated mechanism for reducing speed limits with the state, we could do them in tandem, but not at the same exact time.
Yeah, I see that they could work together, but we don't have to couple those discussions. Abby, I wanted to make sure you had a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting, actually, because this is one thing I do know a lot about. In working with Caltrans and Highway 1, I know that there's a big push to try and reduce lane widths where we can. And so, I mean, even on Broadway and Eureka, I know that they're reducing lane widths, and that's not 25 miles per hour anywhere. So I'm supportive, although I don't have a section here on this chart, I would be supportive about of either looking into this further, or just overall supportive of reducing the lane width, maybe not specifically to 10, but providing a range so staff are able to, if volumes require it, modify the lane width as necessary. Thank you.
And David, the staff position is that based on level of service?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm unmuted. No, that is not based on level of service. I believe that's based on, our typicals for engineering standards for road widths. And I can say that, engineering, I think would be open. I think if the commission, feels that, 10 feet is the width that we should put in as policy, certainly something that you can make as part of your recommendation now, and then we'll ensure that engineering has an opportunity to weigh in before the final decision is made. I also wanted to report back that I know that engineering and the Transportation Safety Committee is looking at reducing speed limits using the new state laws that make that process easier. And I believe on the meeting for September 16th, there's going to be an agenda item to address reducing speed limits in school zones, as a starting point. And I think the Transportation Safety Committee is also considering taking up the idea for reducing it in other streets as well. So I think, it's timely discussion. The other thing I wanted to add is that in addition to reducing the lane width, and to Commissioner Lehman's points, that what that does is frees up area to increase other things, bike lane widths, buffer between bike lane and travel lane for vehicles. The other thing that it does is it adds to the effectiveness of bulb outs at crossings and other traffic calming measures that would go into. So it's not just the lane width that would be, affecting people's behavior as they drive those streets.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Considering that the Transportation Safety Committee is also looking at this, and that we do have a study session with the City Council after they will hopefully come through with some recommendations, perhaps we can make sure that this is something that we bring up with the City Council when we have the Transportation Safety Committee's input as well. But to put this in as a holder, that we would like to consider a default policy of reduced lane width and reduced speed, pending more detailed safety analysis by our city engineers.
Do we have a sense of when that will come up in certainly not in our first session, but I guess my question would be, can staff weigh in as to whether or not it's realistic to think the Transportation and Safety Committee will have weighed in before we broach this with the City Council?
I don't know their timing for that. I can't speak to that.
Okay. How do other commissioners feel about that? Do we want to hit the pause and wait for Transportation and Safety to weigh in and then take this up with the City Council as we have 3 joint sessions coming up, or proceed to a vote for a recommendation?
I'd like to proceed to a vote. If the Traffic Safety Committee wants to weigh in, they can. And they could weigh in after the fact, too.
Yep.
I mean, it's not chiseled in concrete.
Yep. Absolutely. Matt? Proceed to vote. Joel? Abby? Judith? I know where you stand. You just said what you wanted
I've just
to.
said it, and I think the thing that we need to do is perhaps to ask staff to communicate on our behalf with the Transportation Safety Committee on the City Council about when we should raise this again together.
Okay, in the meantime, I think we're voting on a recommendation to reduce lane widths to 10 feet. In favor?
Yeah, so move. And do we want to include reduce the speed limit to 20 miles an hour as part of that? Or do we want to separate them?
I think we should vote on it as written and not pull the speed limit into it right now.
Well, that's fine.
I think the speed limit has been pulled into it. I pulled it in just now, and we had a recommendation from another commissioner to consider that as well.
Okay, fine by me. So, Peter, you voting
I
yes?
move that we, do we need a motion?
I don't think we need a motion.
Oh, all right. Aye.
Yeah. Where are you at with this? I know you're,
I'm in favor of both 10-foot lanes
favor.
and a 25 mile per hour speed limit.
okay. Abby? Okay. Joel?
I'm in favor.
Okay. And Judith, where would you like your vote to land?
I'd be in favor of the reduced lane width contingent on areas with reduced speed limit.
Okay. Majority of the commission is in favor of the reduced lane width and reducing mile per hour to 20. That's correct. So can we move now? I want to make sure we have a chance to get through and look at the recommendations that Judith had made that we sort of paused in her absence. Can we circle back to those now? And then after that, we can look at the time we have left and discuss what the best way to proceed in advance of our joint study session is, whether that's look more at the gateway code or what have you. But I'd like to clear these items that Judith had put forward off, as we haven't had a chance to do that yet. I'd like to get through those.
Scott, there are other items on the bike rack that we haven't gotten to as well.
There are, yes, but I would like to address the ones that Judith had submitted before she went away in June. That's where I'd like us to focus our attention next.
What packet page do those start on?
That's a good question. We were having a discussion about that earlier. David, do you have those summarized somewhere, or can you give us some direction on packet page or bring those up for us?
Yes.
I think they were in various sections.
So I will do my best. I think we're starting here on, excuse me, I believe bullet number 8 or 10. I'm not sure which is the starting point. It's from the current packet, page 69. And I would have to do a little bit of research if you got the previous packet.
Okay, on the previous packet, it was packet page 105.
105, okay, perfect. Thank you.
So 69 or 105, or the screen in front of you.
I think the screen needs to be where we're at, because we can see it.
That works for me. So do you want to give us an intro and walk us through these, Judith?
Yeah, and I'm not sure where we are on the inclusionary zoning requirements after your discussions, and I think David had wanted to bring that up again today. But what's pretty clear to me is that especially if we link it to any kind of community benefits program in the gateway, but in general for the city, if it doesn't kick in except in the largest of projects, we probably aren't going to get the results that we're hoping for in terms of affordability. And as a very modest change here, I had simply suggested reducing the kick-in point to 20 rather than 30 dwelling units in a project. So for example, the Broughton project of last week would then be subject to an affordability requirement, for example. But I think we could set that point at a number of different entry levels and link it to other characteristics of the project, perhaps including some link with owner occupancy or mixed tenure or something like that. I just wanted to make sure that we discussed it and wanted to make clear that the level of obligation to developers was a little bit too lenient in my mind to make it an effective policy tool.
And David, do you want to hit on that briefly, just in light of the overlapping goals of the community benefit and the density bonus, and how a change in the inclusionary zoning would be reflected in buildability and, you know, project assessment, et cetera?
Yeah, I can try and address those. On packet page 7, there's a table 1 that outlines the number of units that would be required for, you know, density bonus, inclusionary zoning for very low income and low income at the various thresholds.
Could you put that up onto the screen, because I don't think any of us have that on paper, and I didn't bring a
It's in the
device.
staff report.
Oh, okay.
It's in the, yeah, it's in the staff report. Let me see if we can pull it up.
Okay, good, thank you.
So as this is coming up, I'll just describe that this is a, you know, tabular form of the graphical form of the video that my department put out recently to discuss the overlap between density bonus, inclusionary zoning, and our community benefits program. And what the table shows is that, you know, at unit counts of 30, 50, and 80, based on the current Planning Commission recommendation to have inclusionary zoning for very low income start at 4% and low income start at 9%. Whoops.
And we specifically pegged it there so as to not get tripped up by that next level of sort of triggering with the density bonus.
Yeah, the idea at the time was to not have the inclusionary zoning 100% overlap with density bonus. And that's what we had discussed at the time when this item was before you last. Numerically, what happens is that even with that slight difference, 5% to 4% for very low income and 9% and 10% for low income, there's actually, until you get up into really high unit counts, way above what we're likely to see in the city of Arcata, there's 100% overlap in the total number of units that are required, because there's rounding required in our unit count total. So where you might have, you know, 1.8 required of density bonus and 1.4 required from our inclusionary zoning, we round those to 2. So you end up with 2 units regardless. And so this gets back to the discussion that in the video that we'd put out there about the overlap in the programs. When you have overlap in density bonus and inclusionary zoning, the you know, developers will take density bonus every time, because there's a you know, because they get benefits that accrue to the project as a result of that. So here's the table I was referring to. If you look just at very low income, and density bonus triggers at 5%, whereas inclusionary zoning currently the recommendation is to trigger at 4%. No matter what size your project is, except for, you know, with 50 units here, there's a difference of 1 unit. It's just because 1 breaks across the whole number, and the rounding gets us to 3 and 2. But basically, you know, for projects of up to 80 units, you're getting 2 units for 30, 3 units for 50, 4 units for an 80. So there's no difference between density bonus and inclusionary zoning. Developers are going to choose density bonus. And when they do choose density bonus, they get concessions. Depending on the total percentage of units that they're providing, they get concessions where they would be able to reduce, things like our community benefits program, things that cost the project money. And those concessions can go up to 4 concessions. And then there are also an unlimited number of waivers that can be requested, demanded by the developer. We don't get to pick and choose. If they can demonstrate that the standard that they're asking for a waiver from impacts their ability to bring that number of units to market, then we have to give those to them. And so putting these affordability restrictions, regulatory restrictions through inclusionary zoning close to density bonus such that they overlap does reduce the impact of our inclusionary zoning. I mean, we still get what we're looking for. It's not a bad thing. We still get the affordable housing, and that's really what we're driving for with that sort of policy statement. It does impact the effect of the community benefits program. I wouldn't go so far as to say we're not going to see community benefits from these projects, but what I will say is that it does impact the effectiveness of those programs. And then it's hard to say which of the standards that we have baked into our gateway code would be subject to waivers, and therefore, we wouldn't see those standards as well, whether it's a step back or a setback or, whatever the architectural features are that we are requiring. So that's how those things interplay. And I don't necessarily make a strong recommendation to reduce the inclusionary zoning requirement to lessen this, but that is why when staff made the recommendation, the initial recommendation, the numbers were 3% and 6%, because then you have separation there. You don't have the same kinds of overlap. In terms of making the threshold for a project at 20 units as opposed to 30 units, I don't have a whole lot of data to support that, one way or the other. 30 units is, I haven't run a pro forma, and the pro forma would change over time. I think I shared this with you when we discussed this initially. The impact of having those units would change financially over time. But my feeling after, my history working for the city of Arcata, working on several pro formas for affordable housing projects, is that when you start getting up into above 30 units, having, 1, 2, or 3 affordable housing units, 4 or 5 affordable housing units out of that mix, and having those rents restricted is not going to be a significant burden on the initial upfront cost. As you drop that number, you're eroding the profitability, the initial profitability of those projects. And you at some point are going to have that impact. I cannot tell you for certain when that happens, except that when we had our threshold at 5 units, when we had inclusionary zoning before, I can guarantee you that's too low. That was having a significant impact on projects, and the only projects that were being funded were those that the city of Arcata participated in financially. So, I don't have a strong recommendation one way or the other. Making a recommendation at 20 and then, accepting that we need to revisit that when we have some projects come forward or do some pro forma work in advance, or maybe rely on, some of the information that we'll get out of the dashboard that we're working with the Turner Center on to help us evaluate that, I guess would be my recommendation.
Does that change your position at all, Judith?
When I'm looking at these numbers, I am realizing that relying on a community benefits or inclusionary zoning program, not just in the Gateway, but in the city as a whole, it is something that I think we started thinking about before the state started ratcheting down the statewide requirements. And to the extent that those requirements have become more stringent, the rationale for Arcata to make them, marginally more stringent has actually kind of been reduced, and it just kind of confuses things at this point. But I feel like if we're seriously going to do any kind of inclusionary policy, it's got to be significantly different than the states to get us anything. And otherwise, it's a lot of trouble for very little benefit. I would imagine that what the Turner Center's conclusions will be is just about any of this stuff is going to discourage housing development because that's how their model is built. But I just sort of feel like starting in at 30 units means that, most projects of an acre or less will be, many of the projects of an acre or less would not have a significant number of guaranteed affordable units as a result. And that by just reducing that number, I guess, in a sense, by an arbitrary amount, we can at least make clear that we do value affordability in the project.
Got it. Peter?
I hear what you're saying, Judith. I think the primary, we do need affordable housing in Arcata, no doubt, but we need housing in Arcata too. And if we, I have no idea how we came up with the 30-unit arbitrary limit. But if we reduce it, that's somewhat of a barrier to more housing being built. For example, I think that developer that was here last time, who had 22 units, probably wouldn't have proposed this project if he had to build affordable units. He would have probably thought that they wouldn't pencil out. So at any rate, all I'm saying is the lower we make that number, the more difficult it will be to just develop housing in Arcata.
I get that. Joel?
I believe I read fairly recently that San Francisco was in the process of substantially reducing its inclusionary housing numbers because nothing was being built or very little was being built. So if a city like that takes action in that manner, it's kind of telegraphing, to us, I think. I want to throw out there that we need housing of all types, and I might be inclined to support Judith on reducing the overall number of 20 to trigger it, but also reducing the percentage as well. And maybe we should rethink based on what David said. I don't know whether there's any sentiment here to reducing our percentage back to what staff originally proposed, and then we increased to 3 and 8 or whatever the percentage was. Because if in fact no one's going to use our inclusionary housing if they can get the density bonus, I think we need to incentivize that, even if it means theoretically, we get less affordable units in our program than the states.
Abby?
I'm just kind of still chewing on the information, but it's nice to listen. Thank you.
Matt, did you want to weigh in on this one?
I'm incredibly torn on this one. It's at like everything Joel said about San Francisco, but then at the same time, I like the suggestion of lowering it to 20. I think I'm almost like a 3 at this point, where I couldn't vote either way.
Can I respond again?
Sure, please.
I don't feel incredibly strongly about this. I think the whole concept of inclusionary zoning, given what the state has been doing, may be a tool whose use has been kind of surpassed. I was on the commission here, I guess I'm the only one of us now who was, when the commission voted to eliminate inclusionary zoning a few years ago. I was the only dissenting vote of that, so, and staff's feeling was that it wasn't effective anyway, but this was during a point when we had a housing construction downturn. It seems to me that when housing becomes a more profitable investment for developers, that is the moment when we can reasonably demand that they build more affordable housing. And it seems that the difference between 20 units and 30 units, the difference between 3 and 5% are very marginal, and in the bigger picture, maybe not that significant. So I also feel that these types of numbers and inclusionary requirements should not just be in the gateway, but should be citywide. For one, it avoids confusion, but it also negates the potential returns on a community benefits item, and so perhaps we need to really think that broader framework of community benefits and density.
I hear, thank you, Judith. I hear the concerns about inclusionary zoning and the overlap with the density bonus, but it's not as if a developer chooses the density bonus versus inclusionary zoning, it's not like we lose the affordable housing. It just comes through a different path. No?
No, that's absolutely correct. The risk isn't that we will have lost affordable housing. The risk is that we will have less effective community benefits program.
And have waivers to the code that we've developed, which we think is the right way to build. I mean, we might get structures that we didn't count on, right?
That's correct.
We might get structures, for example, that are monolithic, you know, the kind of thing we're trying to avoid with the form-based code. Because if a person could claim a series of waivers, they could say, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, I'm not doing this, here's your box.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically impossible to know. There's too many variables for us to assess to be able to know where to set that number. Real estate pricing, market rate for housing, all of the complex variables that go into a developer's decision. I don't see how we could possibly get a handle on what the right number would be without either risking it being too low and therefore discouraging housing, or being too high and therefore overlapping too much with the density bonus. I don't see. I don't think. I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there's a perfect answer there, because we can't know, and the factors that impact it are going to continue to change. So.
If I can jump
Go
in.
ahead, Matt, yeah.
And this sort of builds off of what both you and Judith are saying. I think I suggested last time we talked about this should really be a dial that the city can change based on current economic conditions. And like you're saying, like the idea of setting an amount now and assuming it'll make sense for the next 20 years feels a little bit, silly.
I think the thing that we need to do, though, is if we're going to use this tool at all, to provide some predictability and some consistency, and otherwise, I think maybe it's a tool we should just not add into our codes at this point. We don't have it right now, but it would significantly change how that community benefits program works in this one dimension. Kicking in at 30 units is a fairly large project, and it will allow, I think, most projects to never have to deal with it.
David?
Just a couple things to reflect on based on the conversation you're having right now. First, I put a table together that shows the differences in the total unit count if the threshold was 30 or if the threshold was 20, looking at what the original recommendation of 3% and 6% versus the current Planning Commission recommendation of 4% and 9%. And again, those are for very low income and low income respectively, very low income and low income for the total unit count. The city rounds up its numbers. And so, 0.6 and 0.9, that's 1 unit. So 30 units, you get 1 unit, 20 units, you get 1 unit. For 6%, there's no break here. It's 2 units for each project. For the current recommendation, there would be a break. It'd be 1 unit for a 20-unit project, whereas it'd be 2 units for a 30-unit project, and it'd be 2 units for the low income and 3 units for low income for 20 and 30 respectively. So at the current recommendations, the difference is high enough to actually have a threshold difference between the unit count. And I would say that it's not de minimis. I mean, private market projects right now are almost impossible to pencil to begin with. And so telling a developer up front that I'm going to take the pro forma that you built where you thought you were going to do 30 units or 20 units and all of them were going to be market rate, you're now going to give me at least 1 at very low income or 2 at low income, and that's going to impact your pro forma by thousands of dollars a year when many of these projects are just barely penciling. I think it will have an impact. And so I don't think we can, be dismissive about that. Even at 30 units, it's unclear to me that at 30 units, it will even be, disincentive to the point where we, don't see projects happening as a result of them. Again, that's based on current market conditions. This does have to be an ordinance, so it's not a fine-tuned dial. It would be more like a click type dial that every time we'd have to go back and redo an ordinance, but that is one thing we could do. We can continue to assess the markets and adjust our thresholds accordingly. But I would offer that the reason why the state has increased the attractiveness of the density bonus law is to make it more predictable for developers. The biggest change that they've made is that with density bonus now, the affordable units are on top of the market rate units. It used to be that the affordable units were a portion of your market rate units, and so you were actually losing market rate units to produce these. The way inclusionary zoning would work, that would also be the case. You would be losing market rate units to produce the affordable units, which is another reason why developers would just select the density bonus in almost either situation. If you started at a trigger point of 20 or 30, because they're going to be able to develop out the full total market build out that they had originally proposed. It's still a cost to them to develop under market units. It's a cost that's not fully recouped in their market calculations. But again, this is a little bit of gestalt based on my decade and a half working with the city in affordable housing. But I think at 30 units you're starting to approach that. And I think at 30 units, you're actually going to start to get more like 40 and 50 unit projects that can, then take on that additional burden.
Yeah, I don't see that there's enough extra housing on the line here for us to tweak with the decision we made the last time we came through inclusionary zoning. And so I just don't think I don't think there's enough benefit in messing with our original recommendation, given the complexity and how little extra housing there is potentially on the line. That's where I land on this.
My feelings on this are not particularly strong in relative to other policy decisions we need to make. And I guess I do feel that if this is a tool that Arcata wants to use, we should be using it citywide and not just in the gateway. And that we definitely need to look at that interaction between the city's policies and the rapidly changing state policies that kind of overwhelm their significance. So, you know, if you feel strongly, I'm willing to let this go. But in that case, it probably makes sense to let it go gateway wide rather than just quibble about numbers and percentages.
Again, I would suggest that you maintain the inclusionary zoning requirement because it does, in particular for larger projects, ensure that there's affordable housing baked in. If you wanted to, you know, reduce the numbers or keep the number, you know, to the original proposal or keep the numbers at the existing proposal, which will cause some overlap with density bonus. Either way, I think is a suitable policy recommendation. But if we remove it entirely, we lose the ability to ensure that as, you know, new market rate projects come in, that there's affordable housing, you know, as a requirement in the community. And I agree with Commissioner Mayer 100%. I think we've been talking about having this policy expand citywide. I think certainly at the lower percentage thresholds, it's going to, you know, pencil for almost any project. We'll have to continue to monitor.
Yeah, and we're obviously going to revisit this, given the change in state housing policy and the fact that we haven't really seen projects even begin to be built yet. Peter?
Two things. I do agree, Judith, it should be citywide. And I think reverting back to the original lower percentages is probably a good idea. At least it's somewhat of an inducement to use the benefits program rather than the state program. And that would be to our advantage in the city.
I think I would just like to get a sense of, do we want to, our commissioners, given all this discussion, given the fact that we're sort of retreading ground that we've been down before a little bit, do we want to stick with the decision we made when we discussed this, or do we want to discuss adjusting that decision? Sounds like you're for adjusting. Joel, where do you land?
I agree with Peter that keep the program, reduce the numbers a little bit back to the 3 and 6.
Original staff
Yeah.
recommendations.
Yes.
Abby?
I would just abstain from that decision. Thank you.
Got it. And just so you know, we can hear you when you don't have your mic on, but the folks online cannot without the microphone. Matt?
I would keep it at our recommendation from last time.
Okay, Judith?
I'm willing to let that go. I think this is something that the city should take up citywide. And if we're going to bother with having a program, I think it should be something that would be significant. And, you know, basically we, at this point, are quibbling about, you know, 1 or 2 units in a fairly large development. So that's not going to house Arcata particularly. So I'm willing to let that go.
I'm not sure where that leaves us. Let the proposal go. Sounds like leave the recommendation that we made to me. Is that what you're saying? Our original recommendation?
I still think it should kick in at the level of a smaller project, but you know, as David explained, we're talking about one unit difference.
Well, I'm counting that as a majority to leave our original recommendation as is. So let's move on to the next item for discussion.
Okay. Number 10.
Okay. In looking at the maps of the different areas within the gateway, and I believe that was figure 4 in the most recent edition of the gateway document. I think it was on page 44. Can you get that up easily?
Back to page 44?
Yeah, it wasn't in the comments. It was in the July July 11th, or the most recent version of the Gateway area plan.
And I'm sorry, what graphic are you looking for?
It was figure 4, page 44 of the plan.
Oh, of the Gateway Area Plan?
Yeah. Sorry, you're sort of moving between documents, but it really helps to look at the map. And I stated this wrong in this recommendation. I actually was referring to the Beryl District, and the issue I think is more with the corridor. And I'd actually thank Fred Wise and a map that he posted to show the difference there. But we have proposed Gateway District areas. I think it was figure 4, which is where the map is. Yeah, there you go. That straddle the coastal zone boundary. And when you look at this map, that coastal zone boundary is not included. One of the other recommendations I made was to actually produce a map that includes the coastal zone boundary so we can see where it is relative to our gateway areas. We know that the implementation of our zoning code following the 2008 update was delayed for, I think, more than a decade because of disagreements with the Coastal Commission and the city. And as a result, for many, many years, we had the land use code in the non-coastal areas of the city, and the LUDGI, the land use and development, what is the G? Guide, yes. The land use and development guidelines in the coastal zone. It's crazy making. Our current zoning maps still have that. And I know we have, a better relationship with the Coastal Commission now than we probably had when they threw our last local coastal program back at us, but anything we can do that will be a tool to allow us to possibly savor, as in cut apart, the parts of our programs that are directly subject to the coastal zone rules and the Coastal Commission staff's recommendations, so that we can go ahead with the portions that appear to be not subject to those restrictions, is probably going to allow us to get our gateway area plan element on its feet sooner and with less fuss. There's also the issue of design standards that are in this map, especially in the corridor, going to straddle those boundaries, when in fact we know that there are some design considerations that probably should be different to the north of the coastal zone than they are to the south. And so a simple solution would be to take the yellow area, the corridor, and have a north corridor and a south corridor, or a coastal corridor and a non-coastal corridor. Most of those standards could be identical between them. But to the extent that there may be things that are influenced by coastal protection factors, it would allow us to build those into our policies and whatever zoning is linked to them. It's a pretty simple solution.
Yeah, I do remember we talked about this last year at length, and I remember staff presented, there was a Can you just review for us? I know there was, when this came up, staff had a opinion that this was not going to result in some kind of bifurcation that we'd struggle with in the past.
Yeah, the Commissioner Mayer is absolutely right. In the early aughts, we were working on a update to the coastal program that was intended to be our 2020 general plan and our 2008 land use code. And the city operated for nearly a decade with separate documents. The LUDGI operating south of the coastal zone boundary or west of it, depending on where you're standing in the city. And on the inland portions, we use the land use code. After the 2012, adoption hearings that were not successful, and as subsequent interactions with the Office of Planning and Research with regard to, how our general plan was viewed, as either a citywide general plan or as a general plan for the coastal zone and a general plan for the inland areas, which is, effectively what the Coastal Commission was requesting that we do at that time. And they confirmed staff's interpretation that a general plan is intended to cover your entire jurisdiction. There's certainly ways to have area plans that cover certain geographies, but your general plan is a citywide document. So in around 2013, 2014, the city formally made a shift, and council took action to recognize that the general plan 2020 applied citywide. There's some language in the general plan that acknowledges that in the coastal zone where conflicts occur, the local coastal program regulates. You'll see that same language replicated, similar language in the Gateway Area Plan, because we're following the same process, the same method that was approved by the city council at that time. And so now our land use code applies citywide and our general plan applies citywide, and we have a local coastal program that we're working to update, which will apply in the coastal zone. And the current strategy is that the coastal zoning, then the policies that apply in the coastal zone apply as an overlay would apply. That there's a geographic region that has additional requirements that go above and beyond the requirements that are established in our underlying base zoning, if you will. And so that is the way that the entire structure of the local coastal program update has been discussed with the Coastal Commission to date. It's the way that we've discussed it with the community, the way we've discussed it with the decision makers, and staff strongly recommends that we continue that method in the Gateway area, that we replicate those, that we have underlying zoning districts that are comprised of the decisions that the city has made locally, and where we have to apply Coastal Commission regulation in the coastal zone, that we apply separately for local coastal program amendments and updates that would address the elements of that planning work that affect coastal resources and adopt those into our coastal zone overlay. There are other jurisdictions who have adopted this similar method where coastal zoning is treated as an overlay zone, and I think it's quite effective and eliminates the problems, the challenges that we had previously of having one zoning code that as soon as you make an amendment and you don't get it updated in your local coastal program, you have one zoning code that for all intents and purposes looks the exact same but applies differently across that zoning boundary. So I think this is a much more effective way of communicating with the public what they are subject to and what regulations apply regardless of what side of the street they're on.
And so does that in a sense remove the need to have separate areas in or out of the coastal zone because of the overlay? The ability.
I believe that's the most effective way for us to regulate within the city limits. And there is a diagram at the beginning of the document here that shows the overlapping jurisdictions. This is on page 11, if you want to take a closer look at it on, offline. But it describes in this portion of the Gateway Area Plan how these different regulatory frameworks overlap and how we would treat those. And essentially, if you come in the portion of the Gateway area that's subject to the coastal zoning, our objective would be to update our categorical exclusion area such that the permitting process would be the exact same on either side of that line. Currently, if you're in a categorical exclusion area within the coastal zone, where much of the development potential is already located, and there are few, if any, biological, ecological resources, and your principally permitted activity, a coastal development permit is not required, so there's no additional process associated with those permits. And so we would look to have our categorical exclusion zone incorporate the planning work that we're doing in the Gateway area with a subsequent amendment to our local coastal program.
How does that land, Judith?
You've explained that before. I think in your response to my comments, you were explaining that as well. I think that we have an opportunity here to avoid confusing the public by, in effect, having a 3-layer set of regulatory considerations in the Gateway that's in the coastal zone. By, in effect, cutting through one of those layers in a way that will allow us to more easily harmonize the requirements for the parts of the Gateway that are in the coastal zone. Once we have Gateway, in some areas we're calling them districts, in some areas we're calling them areas with boundaries that straddle that coastal zone line, we're going to confuse people like crazy. I'm pretty good at reading these documents. I'm already confused. And so I think that the very simple fix of putting a boundary in there within our Gateway plan and within the subsequent Gateway zoning that will correspond to that coastal zone boundary will really simplify things both for the public and for the city. The public, in this case, including property owners who need a relatively straightforward way to figure out what regulations they're subject to.
Okay. Matt?
So I appreciate what you're saying. I'm a little bit confused by it, though, because we're not moving the coastal zone boundary, right? And so all current property owners who are in the coastal zone probably know that they're in the coastal zone. When people buy property in the coastal zone, California tells them, right? And so I'm trying to understand why at the city level we need to add that extra level of notification within our zoning code.
We're not adding anything. We're simply saying, we can have a northern corridor and we can have a southern corridor within the Gateway. And we can have slightly different standards because some of those properties in the southern part of that corridor might run into problems that properties in the northern corridor will not. And we will recognize that in our code. And it may or may not affect anything material. We don't know yet. We have not yet written that code. It will also potentially let us add some leniency and possible development incentives in the northern part that would not be appropriate in the southern part. It doesn't matter. It doesn't make anything more complicated. It makes things a lot simpler.
Did you want to weigh in, David?
The only thing I was going to say in response to the last statement about we don't know how it will work is that this is the exact way we've been operating for about 10 years with our current land use code. So I think we have a pretty strong idea how it works and a pretty good track record of actually implementing it. I would offer that, there's been, many sides of this discussion presented. There's a policy pitch included, and maybe it's time to move to a vote on that, or gradients of agreement or something.
Yeah, Joel, where do you land on this?
I'm a little confused. I just need clarification. Are you, at this point, suggesting just a different nomenclature by drawing a dotted line and calling the parts in the coastal zone corridor south or corridor coastal or whatever you want to?
That would probably do the trick. Our current map doesn't actually have that coastal zone boundary imposed on it, so I'm not sure how precisely it will jive, but I think we're basically talking about. I mentioned the Beryl district. It actually is the Gateway corridor. We could say corridor north, corridor south. We could say coastal corridor.
Yeah.
I mean, it adds a little bit of language within the code itself, and it could potentially eliminate some confusion and create some options for the northern part that the southern part doesn't have.
With all due respect, I mean,
Yeah.
we operated for a decade with that, exactly what you're proposing, the exact same system you're proposing, and it was more confusing for the public. I think it's less confusing now, and it wouldn't be just adding a line on a map. It would be doubling every single table. You'd have another coastal designated district, and then you have to ask, like, are we going to go through and distinguish between coastal districts and non-coastal districts? And if not, then it's a distinction without difference. And if so, then I would offer that let's put those distinctions in another document where they could be clearly sectioned off from the things that we want to apply to the entire district.
Yeah, I understand what your concerns are. I don't think, certainly through the lens of confusing the public, adding another district to the Gateway plan, I'm really hesitant to go down that road. I think the overlay zoning kind of accomplishes the overlay, what we're concerned about. So I would like to really just get a vote from people whether we want to stick with the staff recommendation or adopt some kind of change based on the coastal zone and where it runs through. I'm going to start with you, Matt.
I'm happy to leave it as it is. Staff's recommendation.
Abby?
Staff recommendation as well, please.
Joel?
I agree with staff.
Peter?
I do too.
Okay, so we're going to leave as is. Let's move on to the next item. Actually, before we do, a 5-minute bio break. Okay, I think we're back. Can you pick us up where we left off?
Yeah, I believe Commissioner Mayer was telling me at the break that she feels this was adequately addressed by the commission previously, so.
Great.
And then, I'm sorry, Commissioner Mayer, which did you want me to go to next?
So I think that chart that's on the next page, I made some recommendations here that I think when I was not here, you talked about pretty extensively. And I'm probably not going to change anyone's minds based on.
I mean, we had pretty
these
lengthy
numbers.
discussions about the ministerial permit process.
You did talk about that, right?
We did, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you would be willing to, and then the next one is again about the coastal zone, number 14. So that second blip there, I guess we call them bullets. It sounds very military. That area within the Beryl District that would, it's a big holding, and the draft would require a master plan for that area, and then there are a bunch of requirements for that. The way I was reading the draft, it appeared that ministerial approval for the master plan or staff level approval for that master plan would be possible without it coming to the commission. But now I think you've changed some language to indicate that that master plan would come before the commission. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so the master plan is non-regulatory, so ministerial and discretionary don't really apply to it. The individual projects that occur on that property would be subject to the standards in the code and could come in as ministerial permits. The reason why we are suggesting a master plan on this site is because there's so much area available. We want it to be planned and thoughtfully designed ahead of just throwing down a building somewhere, which might conflict with, other uses, roads, trails, public space, So the idea is, hey, let's see a master plan for the entire site, projects that would come in that are consistent with the master plan, and that were consistent with the ministerial pathways provided for in the code would receive ministerial approval. The nexus with the coastal on that, the coastal review again, is that would only be the case for properties in the coastal zone after the Coastal Commission approves a local coastal program update that incorporates the concepts that are applied in the gateway zone. So the master plan itself is not an approval per se, where there'll be ministerial discretionary approval. We do view that master planning process as being something public, where the Planning Commission would review that and say, yeah, that looks like, appropriate planning for that, or what do you think about, modifying these things? We have in our, we want to make sure that it's, consistent with the, the planning for our circulation or mobility element in the gateway, for example. If they came in with something that was inconsistent with that, we'd want to be able to tell them that. So does that make sense?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that, for such a large area, that plan does come before the Planning Commission. And that because the draft plan, as we've already seen it, includes some graphics that include things like greenways within that property without a whole lot of specificity of where they are. It's privately owned land. I think that unless we have more specific design considerations that apply to that site, that site plan really needs to come before us, and I'm not sure how you would frame that. It's the largest single area in the gateway. I don't know how many acres it is.
I don't know off the top of my head those properties either, but I do, again, just to reiterate, I do view, and I believe I'll double check our Gateway Code and make sure that this is explicit. But the intent is that the master plan does come before the Planning Commission.
I'm looking at the language. It's number E, 9.29. Well, okay, I'll just read it. The master plan will be reviewed and approved at notice public hearings in the same manner as required for amendments to this chapter and the Gateway Area Plan if deviations from the standards are proposed.
Okay, the notice public hearing, it doesn't specify a public hearing before whom, and my understanding is that that could actually be at a staff level.
No, this is Planning Commission review, and we might need to work on that language a little bit, because again, it's not intended to be a discretionary approval per se, but it is intended to. The only other master plan that we have in the city of Arcata is the Mad River Community Hospital master plan, and we had recommended that they develop a master plan sort of for the same reasons. It's a very large property. There's a lot that could go on. We want to make sure that what they're proposing is consistent and jibes with the overall planning process. That was adopted by resolution, and I see this being adopted by resolution too, not necessarily as an amendment to the plan, because it's not regulatory to begin with, but the so we may need to work on that language a little bit, but there's absolutely no question in my mind that the intent is that that would happen in a public forum, that the Planning Commission would view that process, the public would view that process.
Okay, yeah, if we could have some language that makes that more explicit, and also some stuff with design standards. I made a couple of recommendations on that, assuming that it's going to go forward as is, but it could be that that's not necessary. I do think that a detailed site plan for an area of that size should be subject to some design review and recommendations. And how we want to do that is it's not entirely clear if it's not a regulatory, a regulatory document. The other area of equivalent size that we addressed in that way was with a development agreement whose design standards appear to have been kind of discarded by the city at this point. And so I'm worried that in this case, we might run into something similar.
Well, we know it's going to come back to us for discussion, so I feel like we know we're going to see it. So
Okay, yeah, if we can have some modified language in the next draft of this that can kind of make that process a little bit clearer, where can we make recommendations, where is there an opportunity for public input, that would be very helpful.
David, can staff just work on the language that was mentioned earlier and bring that back?
I believe it's already in the code, but I will, I will verify that.
You mentioned that you wanted to perhaps look at and I think there's just a general recommendation let's try and clarify that language and
That it goes to the Planning Commission.
Yeah, precisely. Okay, what's our next item?
So the number 15 here is just highlighting the fact that the language in the draft is still assuming that we're going to have an LK Street one-way couplet and doesn't take into account the possibility of a linear park there. I think that the design standards are very much dependent on what we decide. I think we should bring this to the city council and talk that through, but at least in our draft, make sure that we're not making assumptions about what kind of street we're going to have there at this point.
I don't feel like we're making assumptions at all. I mean, we talked about this a lot, and we came up with a recommendation. And that said, on our first, or later this month, when we get together with the city council, we will absolutely be getting into the LNK. I think how that will go is I'll just give a brief intro to the city council of what our recommendation was and how we landed there, and then we will be able to discuss the LNK couplet and any other options that may be on the table. So I still think that's wide open for discussion, and I don't see an issue there at all.
Okay, there's also some design recommendations in the Gateway Hub that would still allow some very, very massive buildings. I know we talked about where step backs should begin. I still think they should begin lower, not on the 5th story, and I still think that we should not allow any building longer than 150 feet for ministerial approval. Obviously, if a developer wants to go through a design review process, proposing a building larger than any building in Arcata off the university campus and a non-industrial use might make sense, but I don't think that those massive buildings longer than 150 feet in the Gateway Hub should receive ministerial approval. So it would be scaling that down for the hub.
Any other commissioners have questions or comments on that proposal by Judith?
I mean, I personally don't want to reduce what's eligible for ministerial approval.
Peter?
Yeah, I don't either, and we're working on the form-based code to provide the kind of buildings that we want, and I think ministerial approval based on the code is fine.
Joel?
I have no problem with what we've previously done on this.
Abby, do you want to weigh in on this?
No, I'm comfortable with the discussion the commission's previously had and not in remaining with that.
Okay.
Okay, I'm hearing everybody, but I'd remind you that we would be offering ministerial approval to buildings that are larger than any building in the city of Arcata, other than a couple of industrial buildings and 2 buildings on the Cal Poly Humboldt campus.
Understood. I think we're all comfortable that we're going to get further clarification with the city council, and that in conjunction with the form-based code, we're going to get the kind of results we hope for. What's the next item for discussion?
On the screen.
You want to introduce this one for us, Judith?
I think we've already addressed that issue. I think you did address that while I wasn't here and made some decisions that
I think so
are
too.
probably going to stand, including, let's see, where do we go down to?
17 now, Gateway neighborhood.
I think you all did address these, and again, the issue is the 150 versus up to 300 feet in length. I think that the active building frontage issues were things that we addressed last time. I'm not sure how you address the bird issue. I can't remember if there was anything open there. That would be after that number 18 in the little box. And I can't remember how you changed the bird safe building standards from before. I just wanted to introduce that the issue with some of these bird safe standards isn't necessarily for a building as a whole, but for a single surface. So by triggering the application of those standards at one percentage rather than another for the building as a whole, you could still have a really large reflective surface that birds are going to bump into on one side, and the building will be fine on the other sides. You could have all of your nice south-facing windows facing south in exactly the areas that are most dangerous for birds and still come in under that whatever percentage it is in the current draft. And so to make it effective, you really need to think of it in terms of the actual dangers to the birds. The lights coming in from the south, if you put all of your southern facing windows so that they're going to get the most solar gain, but the total building still has less than the trigger percentage, you're still going to have dead birds. And it's more of a problem on the upper stories than on the lower stories. So some adjustment there would really help. And I think there are a number of organizations that actually have, sample language for those standards that we could adopt. I think that there are other also highly reflective surfaces that aren't glazing per se, and we really need to think about them as well as just windows.
Can staff weigh in and where there's language that speaks to this?
I have to admit that bird safe glass or glazing is not my area of expertise. We did look for examples from other jurisdictions. This standard was based off some Coastal Commission guidance that I'm not 100% sure is still active. It's a couple years old, 2018, I believe. But it seemed like a reasonable first step and doable step. I don't know if, I don't have an opinion one way or the other on modifying, making it, a smaller percentage of, south-facing facade, or making it, percentage of each facade, or, highly reflective surfaces, I think is already encompassed in that. I mean, that seems to make sense. The idea is that it's not just glass, it's other surfaces that are reflecting, sunlight and vegetation. So certainly that's, seems to be an acceptable trigger. I'm not sure how those reflective surfaces are addressed in terms of modifying them so that they're bird safe. When I did speak with our building official, he said that there are some, in addition to windows that are specifically designed for, bird safety, there are glazings that can be put onto windows. So there are many alternatives for developers to be able to address this. I have no idea what the cost is, how it would impact, development potential or any of those kinds of things. And I guess the other thing that I learned in my research is that, that there are, many jurisdictions that are already requiring this. And so the technology is very well developed.
Yeah, and I think just getting some language, I think Audubon has just updated their recommendations, for example, and I didn't have them in hand when I was writing this.
Joel?
Yeah, I remember bringing up the issue of highly reflective. I was thinking of windows or glazing, but I'll use the broader term surfaces, just as an aesthetic issue. You know, in the city, do we want to see taller buildings, you know, with all these silvery reflective windows? So I think it's something that we need to explore further, for sure.
Abby, thoughts, comments?
I know that this is an issue, and I also don't have that much experience in it, so if staff were to give us some more information, I'd be happy to look into it.
Matt?
I'd be happy to increase the standard. 35% of each facade, I think, would kind of manage the idea you were talking about of like, what if they only put the bird-safe windows on one side of the building? Which I'm trying to imagine the developer who's like trying to trick the birds into hitting the building. But I appreciate what you're saying. I think it's a good fix.
Peter?
No strong feelings.
Okay.
I don't know what the cost implications would be.
We can do a little bit more research and try and bring you back more information on that.
Yeah, if this could be a, whatever color we decided on there, mauve or something, for a bring back, that would be good. I think we all want to see bird safety incorporated, but none of us are experts. So if there could be maybe some a little more fleshed out language, just so we would feel confident we're addressing it sufficiently, I think everyone would find that helpful.
Yeah, thanks. I think that will help. And I just had this image of a 7-story building with south-facing windows. Ooh, ah. Right north of the marsh.
Yeah.
And I said, oops, how do we do that?
Okay, what's the next item for our consideration?
I think the revised draft that I was looking at actually did incorporate the next thing.
Can I just real quick get a confirmation? 17, I heard you concede, Commissioner Mayor. Number 18 appears to be the same topic with a different district.
Yeah.
Covered in the same discussion previously.
Yeah, it's basically the same thing. And I think that we're going to deal with it. For 19, I believe that the revised language did make some changes, but I can't remember.
There were definitely changes in this language.
I'm pretty sure that you took care of that.
Yeah, I feel like there was some discussion around this. I could pull up the language.
Yeah. We did dig into that. No pun intended.
That the Beryl District Community Square is part of that master plan. And I think the language in there was addressing a half-acre space. It seems like it would make sense if we're going to have a meaningful, publicly accessible open space to ask for more than a half an acre, and that we can consider making that a car-free space, which I think is something that Matt and maybe Colin suggested as well.
Yeah, I did too.
Right. I think it would be a reasonable place to have as a car-free space. Obviously, you should be able to drive a car in to make deliveries to shops or to set up for a concert, or, bring in a float for a parade even, or something like that. But I would love to see a car-free space down there.
Joel, do you have an opinion on that item?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Okay, and the second part of that is probably more important, which is to ask the city to consider acquiring the space within that site as an actual public space, not a privately owned, publicly accessible space.
I definitely would support the concept of having that be car-free. I love that. It's not clear to me whether or not the city wants to acquire more park space or has the staffing or budget. Do you have any window into that component of this question?
Yeah, I think the way this is written to consider acquisition, I think is appropriate. We already have a policy that and an implementation measure related that looks to, do acquisitions of these, publicly accessible private spaces and make them fully public spaces. So that I think is completely suitable, and it provides the backing to be able to do so in the future. And then the car-free, certainly I think if you're designing something, you can design it car-free. Staff completely supports that. In terms of larger than a half an acre, I think we need to specify, because that is a minimum half acre. And so, specify what the minimum size of that is. If you want it to be larger than half an acre. As currently written, a space larger than a half acre is exactly what's written in the document currently.
So it could be bigger. It just couldn't be smaller.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a minimum of, the minimum size of the Barrel District Community Square is 0.5 acres.
Would it make sense to change that to a larger number?
Well, I think if we would need to have some specificity over what, if we're creating a minimum standard, then we would have to do better than larger, more specific.
I would suggest an acre.
How big's the plaza? I think it's about an acre. Is that right?
I'm just gonna try and pull that up for you. Yeah, it's a full city block. It's 300 by 300.
400 by 400 is an acre, right? Or can't see that, Fred, sorry.
It's 1.46 acres.
The plaza.
Yeah, a city block is 1.46, not including the roads.
There you go.
So an acre is
1.46.
about the part of the plaza minus the roads, the interior part.
Part of the plaza minus the roads is 1.46 acres.
Oh, okay. So I guess this area, which I would also like to say it doesn't have to be square, because if you're not going to have cars in there, there's not necessarily any reason for it to be square. But anyway, an area larger than a half acre makes it a really meaningful gathering space, or
Well, I
a
mean-
meaningful bit of open space, whereas a half acre is basically, a little courtyard.
I think, given the fact that it says consider, everything is to consider, I feel like that gives us some room to consider, so.
Yeah, well, I think this consider, the way I'm reading this is, Commissioner Mayer wanted the rest of you to consider this proposal. I'm just gonna, let's make this, 1 acre as a starting point is.
I'm not quite understanding this. Why is the word larger there?
Because the previous standard was a half an acre, and Judith is wanting to consider a larger
Oops.
space.
And also, it would be a minimum, and so theoretically, everything would be that or larger.
Or larger, correct.
Right, and this is all kind of
If you,
hypothetical until we have someone interested in doing that master plan for the area and negotiating with the city.
I don't know how much we need to really discuss this. Is anyone that's opposed to this language about a car-free space that's larger than a half an acre? Is there anyone? Matt?
I would be willing to increase it to 1 acre. I think that is a reasonable size increase for
Joel?
a large community gathering space.
Yeah, that would be acceptable to me.
Abby?
1 acre would also be acceptable to me.
Yep.
Okay.
I still think you eliminate that second minimum. Consider a minimum size of 1 acre,
Yeah,
period.
we don't need to wordsmith this piece. I got
Yeah.
it.
The
100%.
editorial piece, the staff can nail down. We're all
Yep.
in agreement
Yep.
conceptually. Let's move on.
What about, and you mentioned that since it's consider, we can leave the city acquisition in there too. Great, great. Okay, so number 22 was the tier stuff, and I think you might have addressed that. That original tier 4 referred to 8-story buildings, but since the maximum is 7 stories, I got really confused about tier 4. And you may have figured this all out while I was gone. So I just maybe didn't understand how you resolved it.
I think Tier 4 became 7-story buildings. It got shoved down.
Yeah, just ratchet into that maximum building height.
So then where did it begin? The tiering?
Used to be at 8. So this was previously 8 for tier 4, 7 for tier 3, 6, tier
Okay.
2.
So we good? Okay, let's move on to the next one.
Do you want to jump to the next substantive topic and skip over the ideas for discussion for now, or?
Yes.
Let's see.
Specific policy proposals.
I think that you addressed the active building frontage.
I'm sorry, which one are you on?
Let's see. There was some material on the building design standards, and I think you did address some of those.
Sorry, what bullet number are you on?
It's I'm not sure how you organize this. I think it was something that you labeled as 10. It was a question for consideration, but it was the gateway use permit. And in the standards in the draft, this is still under questions for consideration, but the use permit threshold indicated only a floor area. And my question had to do with what if the uses don't take place inside a structure, but they're actually outdoor uses? And so because the standard didn't address those, we're basically in a situation where unless we're looking at floor area, we have no regulatory handle for the gateway use permits.
I'm not sure how to address this, without, getting into specifics. Many of the uses you've listed here, I think, would probably not be allowable uses. But But if a project comes in and they're not proposing any development, they wouldn't be subject to the code. Most of these uses are either not allowed or would require some form of development. And so if someone came in and said, look, all I'm doing is building a 20,000 square foot stage, we would say, well, that's triggering the floor area requirements.
What if it's a temporary structure? What if it's something that's not going to require earth moving? It's not going to require a building permit?
We would probably issue a dance permit for that is kind of our process for issuing temporary activities. They go through a dance permit process.
Okay, so you feel this is pretty much covered?
I think so. What I'm gathering from the questions that you've asked, I feel like it's addressed, unless there's something that I'm just really not getting.
They're either not allowable uses currently, or they would be covered by the need for a permit one way or another.
Yes, so material or vehicle storage or transfer, I don't see those as being, consistent with the code. So if someone wanted to come and say move John's Auto Wreckers and do vehicle transfer there, we would say, sorry, that's not consistent with the code. You can't do that in this location, or you can go try and get a use permit from the Planning Commission if you wish to. Outdoor event / entertainment or performance spaces. I mean, if it was truly like, the tent, the circus that we have annually, that would go through a dance permit. We want people to, come and go to those circuses and enjoy themselves. They come up, they set them up for a week or so, and then they go away. And that doesn't really trigger my department getting involved. But if they wanted to make, circus there and be permanent, and it was truly going to be a tent, we would get involved and consider that tent, and we actually have precedent for this. You remember None of the Above, some of us who have been around for a while, who love Indian food, remember None of the Above. They wanted to put up a tent. The tent actually triggered building permit standards, and they went down the whole rabbit hole of planning because of it. And so, yeah, that would trigger for, so it's hard to speculate on what the uses are. I mean, we'd have to address these on a case-by-case basis when they come up, and the way that I make zoning interpretations is one of the first thing I take into consideration is what is explicitly stated in the code. The explicit statements that we adopt are important. The next question I ask is, what was the intention? What can I gather from the intention behind what was addressed? And if those two things are not in conflict, then, that makes it pretty easy. If they are in conflict, then we go with what's explicitly stated as a zoning interpretation, and we bring that difference to the attention of the decision makers and say, hey, this is, a decision that you may want to reconsider and make your language more explicit. A recent example of that was the Formula Restaurant ordinance, where, it's clear from, the background that the committees that were making the recommendation had a specific intent that was not codified. And so we can't regulate based on, someone's intent from 20 years ago. So we regulated based on what was codified, and we asked the council if they wanted to initiate a code amendment, and they said, yeah, we do. We want to implement that intent. And so that's sort of the way this process works. If we're presented with something that doesn't fit squarely in this really broad application of uses in our code, we would do our best to see where it fits within that regulatory framework, and then confirm that that still meets the intent and meets our values and objectives, and process them that way.
Yeah. I don't really see a whole lot of reason to be concerned about this, given this discussion, and I propose we sort of move on to the next issue. I think there's not real...
It looks like to me that all of the rest of these were basically comments with sort of open-ended Some of these, I guess, maybe were miscategorized because these look like specific recommendations for differences or
Yeah, and
changes here.
I think you actually made some of those changes in the text, but I can't remember exactly which ones you did make and which ones you didn't make. There was stuff about the functionality of entries, and I think you addressed that
I think, was that, yeah, that may have been around the design standards for active frontages.
in any case, the point was that an entry that only serves as an exit is not an entry. That's an
Can't
exit.
disagree with you there.
Right. So, and this is really common in a huge building, a building that's 300 feet long. For security reasons, the owner may decide that you have to go through the front entrance, and there may be a bunch of fire exits, but nobody can get in them. And I think that if we're going to have functionality standards in there at all, an entry must serve as an entry, and not just as an exit. And otherwise, we need to really kind of rethink how that design relates to the street. Right? You can have in a 300-foot long building a bunch of doors, right? But if they're actually just emergency exits, they are not functioning as doors. They are not linking to the street. So I don't know how you want to deal with that. That's, I guess, maybe why it was food for thought. But I think if we're going to ministerially approve a 300-foot long building with a desire to have entrances onto the streetscape, we need to require that.
I'll just say I like the suggestion. I think the idea was that there would be entrances and not exits. We had a similar requirement for like individual townhomes, right? That they should each have entrances going onto the street. And so I don't know exactly what the language would be besides entrance, right? But I think maybe we can put a bullet point in that says like an entrance is an entrance, that, you know.
And that's why I suggested specific languages. Entrances required must function for entry as well as exit. Is pretty simple.
And surely fire code and other building codes dictate, doorways and their accessibility.
They dictate for exits, but they tend not to say anything about entry.
I think this is, for context, in reference to what A and B say are, they give the specific standards for how far apart maximally entrances can be. And then it goes on to say that entrance required by those paragraphs A and B that require maximum distances must remain functional and available for use by occupants. I mean, if you want to further clarify by, functionality of an entrance, that it has to be available for entry as well as exit, you certainly could. But I think to, Commissioner Mayer's philosophical point that she made at the beginning of this, an entry that doesn't serve as an entry and only serves as an exit is not an entry. So, we can add the language. I don't think it's necessary, but, it doesn't hurt.
I will also say those larger projects will still come before the commission. And so if they give us a plan with a lot of exits, we can tell them those had to be entrances. Hopefully they're reading the code to say entrance means entrance like we intended it to.
I'm thinking of Hotel California, where
You can never leave.
I actually lived in an apartment like this in Los Angeles, and I would take the fire exit. It wasn't like a alarm will sound fire exit. It was my closest exit to my apartment. And I would open it onto the street, and people on the street would be like surprised someone was coming out of the wall right there because it like blended into the paint. And then, and I get that that's not what we're going for, right? So I appreciate this idea, Judith.
Anyway, I'm sure there's some way we can deal with it. I suggested one way. It seems kind of common sense, but if I were a building developer and I was concerned about security, I would put everyone through that common front door, and all of those would be emergency fire exits, and I would close them up to the street. So it's a way of getting around that. And then there was another standard here with regard to those ground floor entrances, including for townhouses. The code read that they had to have primary entrances facing a street, and I just wanted to add, or publicly accessible courtyard or plaza for projects that are designed that way.
Does anyone have any concerns about that language?
Okay.
Nope.
So the next thing was just a clarification, and I can't remember if you dealt with that in the language or not. The draft said that entrances could be through a patio with minimum dimensions of 5 by 5 feet, and that it must include a row of shrubs, a fence, or a wall, not to exceed 42 inches. What was the rationale for saying it must include that barrier?
I think,
I recommended saying it may include rather than must.
yeah, I think because these are objective standards, you don't do much by saying may include. You could just as easily remove that portion of the sentence. But I think the idea here was to really have some feature that identified that it's, separate from the public sphere, that it's private, but, these are just recommendations. We can modify them and tweak them.
I don't have a problem with that recommendation.
Okay.
So you think it should be may?
I mean, I should clarify. I don't have a problem with the language as it is. I think, if it's may, then it all loses all the power of that sentence, because then it may just as easily may not.
I agree.
So it would seem to be must, or just ditch the whole thing as far from an editorial standpoint.
I would just ditch the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, unless, the commission feels strongly that, these patios should be designated with these features, ditch it.
I don't feel strongly. Yeah, I would say ditch. Joel?
I'm fine either way.
Peter?
Yeah, I'm fine either way. I would kind of lean towards keeping it.
And Judith, are you comfortable with ditch?
I'm fine with ditching the whole thing.
Okay,
Yeah.
then ditch has it.
The next one is the shared garages and parking structures, and I know they're already pretty tightly restricted, but what I was doing in that red thing down there was to make sure that we're not going to have curb cuts with cars coming in across the sidewalk and across the bike lanes on K Street or L Street or any place where those mid-block curb cuts are really going to pose a danger to pedestrians and bikers and strollers and kids, and of course also slow down or potentially collide with vehicle traffic on the road. So I think that there are ways of providing vehicle access while protecting the integrity of that streetscape.
I feel like we talked about this.
We did. I guess I'd ask for clarification by garage. Do you mean garage like a parking garage, or do you mean just like someone's individual private garage?
Well, the portion that this wording is in is for shared garages and parking structures, but I would extend that to other garages and anything that's going to require a curb cut with vehicles, motor vehicles crossing that sidewalk and crossing a pedestrian and bike path in the middle of the block.
Yeah, the challenge here is that, number one, there are several properties that already have curb cuts.
But this is for new uses, right? Aren't those existing properties protected?
Existing properties would be able to continue to use their curb cuts, yes, but if they proposed a project, then they would have to eliminate that curb cut if they had those.
Yeah,
And
that's
some of these
exactly
don't-
what I'm intending.
Yes, and some of these properties do not have access to their property if not provided off of, K and or L Street. When we looked at this before, one of the concepts was to eliminate curb cuts on the interior and exterior streets, 8th and 9th streets around the Creamery building, and try and get folks to enter from behind. And it seemed like a really good idea. And then it dawned on me that that would require a curb cut across the trail off of L Street to access those properties. And that furthermore, that curb cut would have to provide access to the farthest most property away from L Street. And so there just get to be real challenges addressing the timing, because this isn't like one developer coming in with a single proposal. If an interior property or the property farthest away from L Street wishes to develop and you tell them, well, you can't enter from 8th Street, you can't enter from 9th Street, and you don't have an easement, we don't have a mechanism for requiring an easement across the backside of your property through your neighbor's property to get out to L Street, then effectively that property is landlocked and it can't be developed for parking.
So it kind of falls into good idea, but really challenging logistically in implementing.
Without, having the ability to do more of a master planning process and getting, folks on board with, the concept, and then everybody gets the legal agreements in advance of making the requirement.
Yeah, I don't want to do anything that ends up isolating or islanding a piece of property as much as I like the idea. Peter, do you have an opinion on this?
I agree.
Joel?
Yeah, I like the idea in concept. I'm not sure it's going to work in practice.
Abby?
I'd actually wonder if the Transportation Safety Committee could address this, because I think you could actually map exactly which properties they are and figure out how that could be arranged.
Abby, do you have an opinion on this one?
I think it has great intent, but I would definitely need more information. How many properties would be put in jeopardy of having access if this were to be included? So more information would be needed.
I was the one pushing for this when Judith wasn't here and I got outvoted. I do want to just say a property can have no parking on it. People can park their cars somewhere else and walk a block or so to where they're going. That is a feasible state of existence, and sometimes it feels like we don't believe it is, but that's all.
Well, I think that's a pretty even split then.
I do think this is an important issue. I mean, trying to accomplish our policy objectives, we, no pun intended, we keep running into cars. And, how do we balance cars with, what our overall policy objectives are? And at the same time recognizing that, cars are not, going away tomorrow. If we adopt this document, they're not going to suddenly disappear, and then we live in the magical land of, everybody gets financing without providing parking, for example. So I think it's an ongoing discussion that we're going to have to modify our codes and our plans. We have the intent there, and we have the desire to move that forward. I think that there are complexities that we need to iron out with how we provide all of these landowners, and you don't see the parcels here, but for example, here's 8th and L, and there's N Street. We have multiple property owners that, need access. If we say, hey, we want the Creamery District to have this great walkable area where you're never going to have to worry about, running into a car as it's pulling out of a driveway. That's a great goal. I think that's a beautiful place that we could all live in. And, trying to make it so that we didn't just make it so that this property is completely undevelopable, but because of that, that vision is important still, and mapping out how we get there. And that could, be working with the, property owners to come up with, a plan, a process, and some easements that allow us to then implement that standard, or finding a way to say, hey, look, this is going to be a car-free district entirely. And, all the landowners are on board with that, and, we just make it so. So I think it's an important discussion we need to continue on. I would not hold up adoption, if I were you, based on that policy decision, even though it is pretty important. I think we should come back to it.
Okay, so there was another thing that was kind of linked to that, and it was on the packet page 112 from last week. It was number 13, comments on mobility, 9.29.080 mobility. And it was F, down second from the bottom. And it was a recommendation on parking location and design, add after the alley access section, site designs for commercial or residential projects that qualify for ministerial approval may not have primary access for motor vehicles to parking from K Street, L Street, or N Street, if access from an east-west street or from an alley is possible. And I think that addresses the same issue. It's not saying you're going to cut those places off, but if it's possible to figure out alternative access, that we should do everything we can to support the integrity of that streetscape.
Comments, questions, concerns? Anyone concerned with that language? I feel like it's a bit softer. I feel like the other proposal, while I can see residential buildings where people could park on the street, I think it's a different implication for a building with commercial in it, and that changes it for me. This feels a little softer because it talks about primary access and allows for additional options when that's not available. So, other commissioners agreed? Joel?
I'm okay with that.
Abby? Matt?
I'm also okay with the language.
I like
Okay,
it.
so that feels.
That's
that
a win,
feels
Judith.
More reasonable.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a win.
Yeah, that's why it's cool. There's so many sections in the plan. If you can't get it through one section, you can get it through another.
Yeah, the language feels different. Okay.
As long as we're down there, right below there, the bicycle parking, I think we talked about this, but it did come up again in our proposal last week outside the gateway. It makes no sense whatsoever to link the number of bicycle parking spaces required to the number of car spaces. And I think that in the gateway and citywide, we need to require for new unit residential development, a safe, secure bike space for every bedroom.
I know you want to go next, Matt.
We totally nixed this. It was in there and we took it out. And I think we took it out in the general plan as well. So
Okay.
it should become citywide, assuming city council agrees with our bike friendly.
Right. Yeah, so this is what I would kind of replace that with, kind of.
So in favor? Abby?
Yes, I'm also in favor.
Joel?
Yeah, I think to Matt's point, I think we already made this change.
Yeah, I think we covered this, so.
It can be green in two places, right? That's fine.
They're slightly different, though. I mean, the idea that we have a bike parking space for every bedroom is not in this.
No, it's
statement, and
separate.
I
We're
think
adding
that-
it.
Yeah, I think, from a staff recommendation, that would probably go probably a little too far. I mean, you still want to scale, we made the same problem with the Uniontown Shopping Center here. We required way too much parking. That parking lot is never full. And so it may feel good to say, hey, every bedroom's going to have a bicycle space associated with it, but it doesn't really accomplish our objectives, our policy objectives, any more by having vacant bicycle parking spaces than it does having vacant car parking spaces. So I think that, a good mix of, bicycle parking, that are secure. Certainly the way that we've got that structured right now, if you're going to build indoor bicycle parking that's secured and those kinds of amenities, those are community benefits. And I think that there are some requirements for, bicycle parking regardless. And we could take another look at that, but I do think that you would probably overemphasize bicycle parking to the extent where you'd basically just have a bunch of vacant bicycle spaces and having the developers build them when they're not needed.
Go ahead, Peter.
I'd like to push back on that a little. I think having one secure bike space per bedroom is not a bad thing and not terribly overbuilding.
Fair enough. I think the way that I understood it to be, discussed last time is that the bike parking was actually accessible to, to the public, that there would be secured bike parking accessible to the public. And I think that might meet some policy objectives that, aren't necessarily tied to the bedroom, number of bedrooms in the units. I mean, you have to, I guess to convey this maybe a little bit more clearly, every vehicle parking space that you build is basically a bedroom that you're not building, right? You could park a car or you could have a bedroom. Similarly, if you're requiring the developers to build bicycle parking spaces that are going to go vacant, then it feels good. You're building a bicycle parking space, but you're actually taking that away from a living unit.
The ratio is
Yeah,
very
please.
different though, right?
The ratios are, absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
How many bikes do you think you can park in this room? I would challenge someone to actually figure that out because, a space half the size of this room could probably park several dozen bikes, and they're cheap, and they're sending the appropriate message.
also, we used to require one parking space per bedroom, right? Is that correct? And then we dropped it down. Like the idea that bike parking is equivalent to car parking, I think is wrong in terms of both use of space and then also, like, yes, maybe at first there will be empty bike parking, but as people are hopefully shifting away from driving their cars to riding their bikes, you want that sort of space already built in for them. I don't know. I like the one bike per bedroom standard personally.
I also like the one per bedroom, but could you write a code provision that says something like, bicycle parking is X, call it one space per bedroom, unless the project proponent demonstrates, the financial infeasibility of that, or something like that.
We certainly could, but I'd say just write the code based on, what you think the number should be and let the chips fall where they may. And if you get, pushback from the development community that it's just not working, most developers will take a look at that and they'll say, look, I'm just going to build a space, an open space. As Commissioner Mayer said, I think in practice, when you have, a 40-unit apartment complex, many people are going to, find that parking their bike inside the common space is just about as safe as parking it out on the street. I'm hypothetically here, and so, they're going to end up putting their bikes in their bedrooms anyway. I think that, true secure bike parking where people have, individual access to their bikes is going to actually require a lot more space than, just an open space. And I think, having an open space inside a building is a great start, certainly. So, I've heard from the commission loud and clear. I think that you've made it known. I have nothing more to say on the matter.
Good. I think this is probably a good place for us to hit the pause button this evening as we're after 8:20. And so that's what we're going to do. I appreciate everyone's work this evening, and I would like to move on now to correspondence and communications. Does anyone on the commission have any correspondence to share?
I will have to miss our third study session. I guess I'm just making that announcement to you all.
Appreciated.
I'm sorry, what was the announcement?
I will have to miss our third study session with City Council, the one in October.
The October session.
I will also.
The same one?
Yep.
That means the rest of you have to come.
I don't know whether this is appropriate, and you can shoot me down, but since we have like 7 minutes till 8:30, can we ask for public comment for the last 2 minutes or
Public comment on?
on what they heard here tonight? Is that appropriate?
My request was actually that we look into the recommendations that we heard from a few members of the public, that when our agenda is so vague that they don't really know exactly what we're going to talk about, that there be an opportunity for public comment after we've spoken.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, and I certainly understand it. I think one of the difficulties is, certainly from the perspective of looking at agendas and trying to imagine how long an item is going to take, it is impossible to tell. There have been items that I've felt sure we would get through in 5 or 10 minutes and have taken an hour. And so part of the strategy with the agenda is to make sure we have enough leeway that if we're done what's on the agenda, that we have a chance to then keep going and keep working and get into the bike rack. So while it can feel like, I appreciate that it can feel overly vague, I also think in a certain part, there's an intention there that we're not limited if we get through things quicker, because it's just impossible to say, first of all, not only how much time our deliberations are going to take, but how much public comment we're going to get. So when you build an agenda, there's so much guessing game. I think by nature we end up casting a broader net and not getting to everything, but that's better than finding that we're at 7 o'clock and haven't agendized more work and we're done for the night.
I also just would add that the title, recommendation, and introduction are written broadly enough so that you can cover whatever topics you need to cover as you're having your deliberations on this very big process. The staff report itself describes in much greater detail the materials that have been provided for your discussion. And you have hit on, as far as I can tell, with the exception of the joint study sessions, and that's just an informational item, all of the topics that were in the body of the staff report, and you addressed all of the attachments that are in the staff report. And this is a broad and ranging discussion, so those items are included in the staff report.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that question of agendized items versus non-agendized items, or overly broad? I feel like we're doing a pretty good job as far as saying what we're going to talk about and doing our best to get through it. Okay, we're getting closer to 8:30, so I'm going to move. We're in correspondence and communications. The only thing I would like to share here for correspondence and communications is somewhat of a homework assignment, which is just to make sure that along with the public, which I know is going to be watching it, that we all watch the video that's already been released on housing, inclusionary zoning, community benefits, density bonus. as well as the video that will be released on the L&K couplet in advance of our study session with the city council, so that we're all as up to speed on our review there and can sort of hit the ground more or less running with the benefit of that, those two videos.
Can I ask, when do we expect the LK couplet?
You could ask David.
That'll be out by this Friday at the latest.
This Friday at the latest. Okay, I appreciate that. Any correspondence from staff this evening, David?
I don't.
Okay, there being no further business, this meeting is adjourned.